The room smelled like bleached stale coffee and money. Not real money. Hospital money. The kind that disappears one insurance claim at a time, while someone in khakis explains why a single Tylenol costs $14. I sat at the far end of the consultation table in my army dress uniform, with my hands folded in my lap. Across from me sat the two people who had contributed DNA to my existence, and absolutely nothing else for the last 15 years. Arthur looked older than I expected. Not softer. Sick people in movies always look fragile and reflective, like they suddenly understand the meaning of life. Arthur looked annoyed. His skin had that gray-yellow tint that comes from years of abusing your organs and pretending golf counts as cardio. The dialysis machine beside him beeped steadily. Beatrice sat upright next to him wearing pearls and a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my first used car. She looked exactly the same emotionally, expensive, cold, deeply concerned about appearances. Neither of them had asked how I was. No, how have you been? No, are you okay? No, we missed you. Nothing. Beatrice slid a packet of papers across the table like she was passing me a dinner menu. We already spoke with the transplant coordinator, she said. The hospital can fast-track the procedure because you're an ideal match. Ideal match. That was the phrase. Not daughter, not Clara, not human being. Ideal match. Arthur leaned back carefully. Probably because moving too fast now came with consequences, his liver could no longer negotiate away. You're the only one, he said. Chloe wasn't compatible. Of course she wasn't. The universe apparently had a sense of humor after all. I looked down at the paperwork. Surgical consent forms, psychological evaluation waivers, risk disclosures, follow-up care requirements. I knew every form in the packet. Not because I spent my evenings reading hospital literature for fun, like some deeply disturbed medical nerd. I was a medical logistics officer for the United States Army. I'd spent years coordinating surgical transport chains, emergency medical inventories, recovery protocols, and transplant support systems for military hospitals. I knew exactly what kidney donation involved: recovery time, long-term risks, mandatory psych screening, possible complications. I also knew something else. No ethical transplant team in America liked family pressure cases, especially when coercion was involved. And judging by the way Beatrice kept staring at the pen beside my paperwork, like she expected me to perform on command. Coercion was sitting right there in Chanel lipstick. You should sign today, she said. There's no reason to drag this out. I looked at her for a few seconds. 15 years without a birthday card, without a phone call, without so much as a badly written Facebook message pretending to care. And now she was rushing me to hand over an organ like we were renewing a Costco membership. What exactly do you think happens here? I asked. Arthur frowned. What does that mean? I said calmly. You found me through a DNA database. You contacted the hospital before contacting me personally. You had the transplant coordinator call first because you thought I'd respond better to authority. Beatrice crossed her arms. We didn't have time for emotional dramatics. That almost made me laugh. Emotional dramatics. This from the woman who once cried for 2 straight hours because Chloe didn't make homecoming court sophomore year. You would have thought the government collapsed. Arthur cleared his throat. Look, nobody's asking for a miracle here. Actually, that was exactly what they were asking for. A miracle with anesthesia. He continued. You're healthy, I'm sick, family helps family. There it was again. Family. People love using that word right before asking for something expensive. Money, housing, free childcare, an organ. I sat back in my chair and studied them carefully. It hit me then that neither of them looked nervous. Not really. They looked irritated. Like this meeting was an inconvenience standing between them and a solution they already considered theirs. That was the part that fascinated me most. Not the audacity, the confidence. Because confidence like that doesn't appear overnight. It comes from years of getting away with things. Beatrice tapped the paperwork. You've done very well for yourself, apparently, she said, glancing at my uniform. So clearly we did something right. There it was, the retroactive parenting claim. Classic narcissist math. Abandon a child. Ignore them for 15 years. Reappear once they become successful. Then take partial credit like you personally built them in a garage workshop. I almost admired the efficiency. Arthur shifted uncomfortably beside the dialysis machine. The steady beeping filled the silence. You don't need both kidneys, he muttered. That one actually landed. Not emotionally, professionally, because it was such a stupid thing to say. That's the problem with entitled people. Eventually, they get so used to manipulating emotions that they stop sounding human altogether. You're right, I said evenly. And technically, you don't need that summer house in Naples either, but here we are. Beatrice's expression tightened immediately. Good. Now we were finally speaking the same language. Money, image, status. The holy trinity of their religion. Her voice sharpened. This bitterness is unnecessary. Bitterness. Interesting word choice from someone holding surgical consent papers 5 minutes into a reunion. I picked up the packet slowly. Arthur watched my hands like a gambler watching dice roll across a table. I flipped through the pages one at a time. Consent acknowledgement, independent donor advocate information, psychological screening authorization, post-operative restrictions. I stopped at the signature line. Then I looked up at my mother, really looked at her. Same perfect hair, same polished makeup, same dead eyes, and suddenly I wasn't 31 anymore. I was 16, cold hospital sheets, cheap fluorescent lights, an empty room, no visitors, no parents, just machines making sounds nobody should ever hear alone as a kid. I placed the papers back down carefully. You lost the right to my medical decisions, I said quietly. The day you left me to die in a room exactly like this one. Silence. Actual silence. Not offended silence. Not dramatic silence. The kind where people suddenly realize the version of history they rehearsed in their heads may not survive contact with another witness. Arthur looked away first. Of course he did. Beatrice's face hardened instantly. Because people like her never apologize. They reorganize reality instead. That is an extremely manipulative thing to say, she replied coldly. I nodded once. See, I said that's exactly why the psych evaluation is going to be very interesting. The dialysis machine continued its steady rhythm beside Arthur's chair. Beep, beep, beep. And somewhere underneath that sound, buried deep in the back of my mind, another hospital monitor started coming back to life. The sound pulled me backward before I could stop it. Beep, beep, beep. Different hospital, different year, same feeling in my stomach. I was 16 when my appendix ruptured. Not the dramatic movie version where someone collapses in the middle of a football field while orchestral music plays in the background. Real life is less cinematic. Real life is spending 2 days thinking you have food poisoning because your parents already accused you of faking sick twice that month. By the time Arthur finally agreed to take me to the ER, I could barely stand upright. The doctor figured it out in under 10 minutes. My appendix had burst sometime earlier that day. Infection was already spreading through my abdomen. Everybody in the emergency room suddenly started moving very fast, which is never comforting. A nurse cut off my hoodie with trauma shears, while another shoved paperwork at Arthur. Beatrice kept sighing like this whole thing had been scheduled at an inconvenient time, because technically to them it had. Chloe had a regional cheerleading championship in Nashville that weekend. I remember that detail specifically because Beatrice mentioned it 4 separate times while I was vomiting into a plastic hospital bin. We already paid for the hotel package. Chloe worked very hard for this. Do you know how competitive these events are? At one point, while a nurse was inserting an IV into my arm, Arthur actually asked the surgeon how long appendectomies usually took because they were trying to coordinate travel plans. The surgeon stared at him for a second, like he was deciding whether punching a parent violated hospital policy. I got wheeled into surgery sometime after midnight. Then everything disappeared for a while. When I woke up, my throat felt like sandpaper and my entire body hurt. There's a specific kind of pain after abdominal surgery. It feels like somebody replaced your organs with broken glass and then charged you parking fees for the experience. The room was dark except for the monitor beside the bed. Beep, beep, beep. I remember turning my head slowly toward the visitor chair beside the window. Empty. No flowers. No jacket draped over the armrest. No exhausted parent sleeping upright in uncomfortable hospital furniture like normal people on Earth. Just empty space. At first, I thought they'd gone downstairs for coffee. Then a nurse walked in. She checked my vitals, adjusted something on the IV pump, and gave me the kind of smile medical workers use when they already know something awful. Oh good, she said softly. You're awake. My voice barely worked. Where's my mom? The hesitation lasted maybe half a second. Too long. The nurse glanced toward the counter outside my room before reaching into her scrub pocket. They left you a voicemail. A voicemail. Not a note. Not a conversation. A voicemail. She handed me the hospital phone carefully like it might explode. I pressed play. Beatrice's voice came through cheerful and rushed, like she was calling from an airport gift shop. "Hi, sweetheart. The surgery went fine, obviously, because the hospital would have called otherwise. Listen, Chloe's competition team already left for Nashville, and we can't afford to miss her big moment over an appendix. Your father left cash in your backpack for vending machines. We'll check in soon." Then she hung up. No, I love you. No, are you scared? Nothing. Just logistics. Like I was a package delayed in shipping. I stared at the phone for a long time after the message ended. The nurse quietly took it back without saying anything. People think trauma always arrives as some explosive moment where your entire world shatters instantly. Most of the time it's quieter than that. It's realizing nobody's coming back. Morning came eventually, then afternoon, then another night. Still nobody showed up. A hospital social worker started visiting my room on day 2. Her name was Denise. Late 40s, wore chunky bracelets that clinked together when she wrote notes. She spoke to me very carefully, which told me she already suspected more than I was saying. "You have any other relatives nearby?" she asked gently. "No, family friends," I almost laughed. Arthur and Beatrice didn't have friends. They had networking opportunities. By day 3, even the nurses looked uncomfortable. One of them smuggled me extra pudding cups because apparently abandoned teenagers trigger maternal instincts in ICU staff. Another helped me wash my hair in the sink because I couldn't lift my arms properly without pain. Complete strangers treated me better in 72 hours than my own parents had in years. That was the part that really stayed with me. Not the abandonment itself, the comparison. On the 4th day, Denise finally reached Arthur directly. I heard part of the conversation from my bed because her office door was open down the hall. "No, sir, she cannot discharge herself." Pause. "No, sir, she's still a minor." Longer pause. Then Denise's expression changed completely. Cold, flat, professional. "The issue, Mr. Bennett, is that your daughter just underwent emergency abdominal surgery and currently has nobody available to transport her home safely." Another pause. Then she slowly rubbed her forehead. "No, sir, public transportation is not considered appropriate post-operative care." That one made me close my eyes, because I already knew exactly what Arthur had said. Bus schedule. That sounded like him. Efficient, cheap, emotionally dead. When Denise came back into my room, she sat beside the bed quietly. "You doing okay?" she asked. I nodded automatically. That's what kids like me do. You learn early that making adults uncomfortable usually creates more problems for you later. She studied me for a few seconds. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "Clara, has this kind of thing happened before?" And there it was, not concern, recognition. An adult finally recognizing a pattern instead of an incident. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. She already knew. The ride home finally came late that evening. Arthur picked me up alone in complete silence. The first thing he said after helping me into the car wasn't, "How are you feeling?" It was this: "Do you have any idea how much this hospital stay cost?" I turned and looked out the window for the entire drive home. That was the moment something inside me stopped trying. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just permanently. People always ask when children become adults. For me, it happened in room 412. I stopped expecting protection after that. Stopped expecting comfort. Stopped expecting love to arrive eventually if I just behaved correctly long enough. By 17, I had a part-time job, a private bank account, and copies of every important document I could legally access. Birth certificate, social security card, school transcripts. I researched emancipation laws at the public library because this happened before. Smartphones made everybody an amateur lawyer. The judge reviewed my paperwork for less than 20 minutes. My parents barely argued. That part still makes me laugh sometimes. Most parents fight to keep their kids. Mine signed the documents like they were canceling a gym membership. I left 3 weeks after my 17th birthday with 2 duffel bags, $800, and absolutely no intention of ever coming back. And somehow, against all odds, disappearing turned out to be the healthiest thing that family ever gave me. Back in the consultation room, my thumb brushed slowly across the inside of my wrist, where the faded yellow hospital bracelet used to sit. Then I lowered my hand back onto the pristine cuff of my military uniform. I adjusted the cuff of my jacket slowly and watched Beatrice's eyes track the movement. People notice military uniforms differently depending on who they are. Some people see service, some see authority, some just see free airport boarding. Arthur and Beatrice saw status. That was the funny part. If I had shown up looking exhausted and broke, they would have spoken to me like charity work. But the second people like them see medals and clean tailoring, their entire personality shifts into networking mode. Suddenly, you're not disposable anymore. You're useful. Arthur cleared his throat again. You never mentioned the army. I almost said you never asked. Instead, I kept my voice neutral. It's been a while, 15 years technically, but who's counting besides the abandoned child with medical trauma? Beatrice leaned slightly forward. What exactly do you do there? It was not concern, not curiosity about my life. Financial assessment, social ranking. Could they brag about this to friends at the country club without mentioning the whole abandonment thing? I manage medical logistics, I said. Arthur nodded slowly like he understood what that meant. He absolutely did not. Most people hear medical logistics and imagine someone organizing band-aids in a supply closet. In reality, my job involved coordinating transport systems, surgical inventory chains, emergency procurement, federal compliance documentation, and enough classified paperwork to destroy an average civilian's will to live. I once spent 14 straight hours rerouting emergency plasma shipments during a hurricane while a colonel screamed into 3 phones simultaneously. After that, dealing with emotionally manipulative parents felt like a relaxing side quest. Beatrice tapped the consent packet again. Well, she said carefully, then you understand how important timing is here. I almost smiled. Oh, I understood timing perfectly. That was why I wasn't signing anything. Not yet. Because once I left that consultation room, I knew exactly what would happen. They'd start applying pressure, calls, messages, guilt. Probably Chloe eventually, because every dysfunctional family keeps one emotional support attack dog in reserve. But first I needed information. And fortunately for me, hospitals run on documentation. I looked back down at the forms. I'll do the preliminary testing, I said calmly. The relief on Beatrice's face appeared instantly. Not emotional relief, strategic relief. Like a woman watching an expensive legal problem start resolving itself. Arthur leaned back carefully in his chair. I knew you'd do the right thing. That sentence sat in my skull like expired milk. The right thing. Interesting phrasing from a man who once tried to send a post-surgery teenager home alone on public transportation. But I nodded politely anyway, because sometimes the fastest way to expose people is to let them think they're winning. The transplant coordinator entered a few minutes later with a clipboard and professionally exhausted eyes. She introduced herself as Melissa and began explaining the next phase of compatibility testing. Cross-matching, full metabolic panels, genetic verification, psychological screening, independent donor advocacy. I noticed Arthur zoning out halfway through the explanation. Of course he did. Men like him hear medical information the same way toddlers hear tax advice. Meanwhile, I could have taught the presentation myself. Melissa handed me another set of forms. You'll also receive access to portions of the family medical history relevant to donor compatibility, she explained. That was the sentence I'd been waiting for, because something about this entire situation bothered me. Arthur's kidneys weren't failing randomly. Healthy people do not suddenly require emergency donor matches at 63, unless something catastrophic happened medically. Diabetes, autoimmune disease, long-term hypertension, drug damage, alcoholism. And based on Arthur's complexion alone, I already had suspicions. I completed the initial blood draw that afternoon. Beatrice kept trying to act maternal during the process, which was honestly more disturbing than hostility. She touched my shoulder once and said, I know this is scary. Scary, ma'am. I worked through a military hospital overflow crisis during flu season. I once watched 2 surgeons argue over an organ transport cooler while somebody threw up into a biohazard bin behind them. This wasn't scary. This was annoying. A few days later, I received secure access to the preliminary medical records connected to the transplant review. I opened the files from my apartment kitchen table while eating leftover Thai food and listening to rain hit the windows. Very glamorous espionage atmosphere. What I found took less than 20 minutes to piece together. Arthur had been a severe alcoholic for years. Not casual country club martini drinking. Advanced dependency. The records showed repeated elevated liver enzymes, chronic hypertension, dehydration episodes, and multiple physician notes referencing continued alcohol consumption despite medical advisement. There were even recommendations for treatment programs. Ignored. Every single one. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. Suddenly, the entire family dynamic made perfect sense. The bloated face, the irritability, the financial instability buried under designer clothes, the desperation. Beatrice had spent years protecting an image while Arthur quietly pickled himself from the inside out. And based on the notes, several doctors already suspected alcohol-related renal deterioration long before dialysis entered the picture, which meant this wasn't tragedy. It was maintenance failure. I kept reading. One physician note stood out immediately. Patient's spouse minimizes alcohol intake during consultations. Reports from patient inconsistent with lab findings. There she was, Beatrice, managing perception like it was a full-time occupation. I could practically hear her voice inside the exam rooms. Oh, Arthur just enjoys wine with clients. He's under stress from work. We entertain a lot socially. Translation. My husband drinks like a divorced casino magician, but we belong to a country club, so please respect our privacy. The deeper I dug, the uglier it became. Arthur had missed follow-up appointments, ignored dietary restrictions, continued drinking after being warned about kidney deterioration. At one point, a nephrologist documented concerns about non-compliance and family-enabled behavior patterns. Family-enabled behavior patterns. That's medical language for everyone around you helping you self-destruct politely. And suddenly I understood why they had rushed so aggressively toward me. Because living donor approval committees evaluate cause of organ failure too. A patient who destroys a donated kidney through continued addiction becomes a liability risk, meaning Arthur didn't just need a donor, he needed a clean narrative. Enter the long-lost daughter, military officer, responsible, stable, successful, perfect redemption story. They weren't trying to save a father, they were trying to repair a reputation. I closed the laptop slowly. Outside rainwater slid down the apartment windows in crooked lines. I thought about 16-year-old me lying alone in room 412, while Arthur was probably drunk at a hotel bar, pretending to celebrate Chloe's cheer competition. And now his body was collapsing one organ at a time, while Beatrice desperately polished the public version of events. Honestly, if irony burned calories, that woman would have disappeared years ago. I reopened the file and kept reading. Because once you grow up around people who lie professionally, you learn something important. The truth is never hiding in one document. It's hiding in the paperwork they forgot to clean up. And the medical records weren't the only thing that background check uncovered. I zoomed in on the transaction history and immediately felt that strange little shift in my stomach that happens right before something bad becomes measurable. Most people ignore financial documents because they're boring. Personally, I love paperwork. Paperwork is honest. People lie constantly. Documents usually don't. I kept scrolling through the records tied to the transplant background review, insurance disclosures, asset verification forms, emergency contact information, standard administrative junk designed to make civilians lose consciousness halfway through page 3. Then I saw my grandmother's name, Margaret Ellis. That stopped me cold. My grandmother died when I was 14. She was the only person in that family who ever treated me like I existed outside of inconvenience. She smelled like peppermint lotion and chain-smoked Virginia Slims on the back porch while insulting politicians from both parties equally. Honestly, she was magnificent. Before she died, she set up a small college fund for me. Nothing massive. Around $20,000 in a joint custodial account until I turned 18. I hadn't thought about that account in years. Mostly because by 17, I was too busy surviving to obsess over old money that probably vanished into legal limbo. But now the account appeared in the background review because Arthur had listed old family financial connections and during transplant eligibility disclosures, which was odd already. Then I noticed the closure date, 2 days after my surgery. I stared at the screen for a long moment. No movement, no blinking, just that date sitting there quietly like a loaded weapon. I opened the archived records attached to the account. Withdrawal authorization, closure request, transfer confirmation. And there it was, my signature, except it wasn't my signature, not even close. It looked like somebody tried to forge my handwriting after watching me fill out a homework assignment from across a parking lot. I leaned back slowly, then forward again, because suddenly every piece started locking together. The timing, the hospital abandonment, the sudden disappearance of the college fund. The fact that nobody ever mentioned it afterward. Arthur and Beatrice didn't forget about me after room 412. They monetized me. I printed the records immediately. Page after page slid out of my printer, while my apartment stayed completely silent around me. The total amount transferred sat at the bottom of the statements in neat black numbers. $18,450. Not withdrawn gradually. Not used for medical bills. Transferred in one coordinated move into another account connected to Arthur and Beatrice. I kept following the documentation trail. Fortunately, rich people love records almost as much as they love pretending consequences are for other people. 3 weeks after the transfer, there was a documented payment to Southeastern State University, Chloe's freshman tuition deposit, then another payment, vehicle financing down payment. I actually laughed out loud at that point. Not because it was funny, because the audacity was almost artistic. While I was recovering a loan from emergency surgery, my parents emptied my college account to buy Chloe a better freshman experience. I could practically reconstruct the conversation. Well, Clara probably won't even go to college now. She's difficult anyway. Chloe needs reliable transportation. Translation. The useful daughter requires investment. The inconvenient one can figure it out herself. And the worst part, they probably never considered it theft. That's how entitled people think. Everything connected to you belongs to them emotionally. First legally, second, your time, your success, your boundaries, your body apparently. I pulled up the scanned withdrawal authorization again. Arthur's signature appeared clean and confident. Beatrice signed as witness. My forged signature sat underneath theirs like a hostage note. The timestamp hit me next. The transfer occurred at 9:42 a.m. I checked the surgery records from room 412. At 9:42 that morning, I was still hospitalized, still medicated, still unable to walk without assistance, meaning they forged legal financial documents while I was lying in a hospital bed trying not to split open surgical stitches every time I breathed. I rubbed my hand across my face slowly. Then I did what years in military logistics trained me to do. I organized evidence. One folder for medical abandonment documentation. One folder for transplant records. One folder for financial fraud. Everything scanned. Everything time-stamped. Everything backed up twice. People think revenge comes from rage. Real damage comes from administration. You know what terrifies wealthy people more than screaming paper trails? I spent the next hour reviewing every archive statement connected to the account. That's when another detail surfaced. A memo note attached to one transfer. Chloe housing balance, housing balance. I closed my eyes briefly, because suddenly I could see it perfectly. My sister unpacking decorative pillows in some out-of-state college apartment while I recovered a loan from emergency. Surgery with pudding cups donated by nurses. And honestly, that explained Chloe too. Golden children don't become entitled accidentally. Somebody builds them that way. Every sacrifice in that house flowed toward her. Every excuse protected her. Every resource got redirected toward her future, while mine became negotiable. And now the entire structure was collapsing. Arthur's body was failing. Their money was tighter than they admitted. The perfect daughter wasn't a donor match. So suddenly the disposable child became medically valuable again. I looked around my apartment quietly, small but clean. Everything inside it belonged to me. Every plate, every lamp, every framed military commendation on the wall. Mine, no inheritance. No family help, no safety net. Just years of work and stubborn refusal to die inconveniently. That realization settled over me differently now, because I finally understood something important. I hadn't escaped those people emotionally until years later, but financially. I escaped them the second I stopped believing I needed permission to survive. My phone buzzed against the table. Unknown number, I ignored it. Then it buzzed again. Voicemail notification. Then another call immediately after. I let it ring out. A text appeared seconds later. Beatrice, your father is under tremendous stress. We need to move quickly with the donor process. No greeting, no apology. Straight to organ harvesting logistics. Amazing. I stared at the message for a second before locking my phone again. Then I reached for the thick stack of printed statements sitting beside my laptop. The pages felt heavier now. Not emotionally, legally. Because this wasn't family dysfunction anymore. This was documented fraud against a minor. I stacked the papers neatly and dropped them onto my desk. Thud. The sound echoed through the apartment. And almost immediately afterward, 3 hard knocks slammed against my front door. Not polite knocks, aggressive ones, rapid, sharp, expensive person knocks. I already knew who it was before I even stood up. I opened the door halfway and immediately regretted learning how to identify expensive perfume by brand. Chloe stood in my hallway wearing oversized sunglasses, white designer sneakers, and the exhausted expression of a woman whose entire personality had been outsourced to Instagram parenting accounts. She looked older than me somehow, not physically, spiritually, like life had finally started charging interest on all the shortcuts. Well, she said, lowering the sunglasses slowly, this is depressing. She hadn't seen me in 15 years. That was her opener. Not hello, not wow, not I'm sorry we treated you like an optional family subscription. Just criticism of my apartment square footage. Honestly, consistency is important in families. I leaned against the doorway. How'd you get my address? Mom had the hospital pull your donor contact file. Of course she did, because apparently HIPAA becomes more of a suggestion once wealthy people panic. Chloe walked inside without waiting for permission. Another family tradition. She glanced around my apartment with the same expression people use inspecting hotel rooms on Yelp. You really live here. I shut the door quietly behind her. Yes, Chloe. Some of us don't have stolen college money financing our lives. That landed harder than I expected. Her face tightened instantly. Interesting. So she knew, or at least suspected. But instead of addressing it like a normal human being, she pivoted immediately into offense. Look, I'm not here to fight, she said. Dad's situation is serious. Then she pulled a manila folder from her purse and handed it to me. Typed schedules, calendar printouts, recovery timelines. I stared at the pages for a second. You made me a spreadsheet, she sighed dramatically. Well, somebody had to organize this because Mom's emotional and Dad's useless right now. That sentence almost deserved applause. Nothing says loving daughter quite like referring to your father as defective office equipment during organ failure. I flipped through the paperwork slowly. She had planned everything. Proposed surgery dates, post-op recovery windows, transportation arrangements, meal prep notes. Then I saw something that made me blink twice. Childcare rotation options. I looked up. Excuse me, Chloe waved her hand dismissively. Oh, that part actually makes the most sense. I waited. Because when entitled people think they're being reasonable, they eventually say something unbelievable for free. She sat down at my kitchen counter like she owned the lease. So obviously you'll be recovering for a few weeks anyway, she explained. And since you're taking military leave, we figured it would be easier if you stayed at our house after surgery. Our house. Interesting wording considering I'd rather recover inside an active volcano. I kept reading silently. Then I found it. A highlighted note. Chloe plus Mark. Possible 5-day stress recovery trip during Arthur's surgery week. I stared at it. Then back at her. You planned a vacation? She looked confused by my tone. Not a vacation, she clarified. More like a mental reset. A mental reset, of course. Because nothing says emotional hardship like abandoning your kidney donor sister with 3 children immediately after major surgery, so you can sip margaritas near a hotel pool. I set the papers down carefully. You want me to recover from organ donation while babysitting your kids? Well, when you say it like that, it sounds bad. I actually laughed. A short one, sharp enough to make her uncomfortable. Chloe crossed her arms. You don't understand how stressful this has been for me. There it was, the sentence every golden child eventually says when somebody else starts bleeding. I studied her quietly for a moment. 3 kids, massive mortgage. Husband probably drowning in debt, trying to maintain appearances. And now the family financial system was collapsing because Arthur's medical bills were piling up. Suddenly her desperation made sense too. This wasn't about saving Dad emotionally. This was about stabilizing the machine. Because if Arthur died, broke the whole illusion cracked open. Country club memberships, vacation photos, private schools. The carefully curated upper-middle-class fantasy held together with debt and Chardonnay. Chloe needed this transplant to work because the alternative threatened her lifestyle. Meanwhile, she still talked to me like I was the unpaid intern assigned to family maintenance. You know what's amazing, I asked. She frowned slightly. What, you haven't asked a single question about my life. She rolled her eyes immediately. Oh my God, Clara, this isn't the time to unpack childhood feelings. Childhood feelings. Interesting way to describe felony fraud and medical abandonment. I leaned back against the kitchen counter. You know they stole my college fund, right? Her expression froze. Just for a second, but that second told me everything. Then came the recovery attempt. I don't know what Mom told you. She didn't tell me anything. The bank records did. Silence. Chloe looked away first. Again. Funny how truth affects people physically. I was 18, she muttered finally. I didn't control their finances. No, I agreed. You just benefited from them? That irritated her immediately. I didn't ask for any of this. That part was probably true. Golden children rarely ask directly. They just grow up watching resources flow toward them automatically until it feels normal. The scholarships go to them. The emergencies revolve around them. The sacrifices get made for them. And eventually they stop noticing who gets sacrificed. Chloe stood abruptly and started pacing my apartment in irritated little circles. You know what your problem is, she snapped. You always make everything so dramatic. I almost admired that one. A woman holding a kidney donation scheduling packet, while asking her estranged sister to provide free childcare after surgery, was accusing someone else of drama. America truly runs on confidence. You disappeared for 15 years, she continued. Mom cried constantly after you left. I raised an eyebrow. Did she cry before or after stealing $18,000 from a hospitalized minor that stopped her cold? Good. Finally, reality. The room went quiet for several seconds. Then Chloe did something fascinating. She softened. Not genuinely, strategically. Her voice lowered. Look, Dad really is sick. And there it was underneath everything else. Fear, real fear. Not for me, not even fully for Arthur. Fear of losing control. Fear that the family system she depended on was finally failing beyond repair. I understood that fear better than she realized. The difference was I learned how to survive without them years ago. She never did. I picked up the printed schedule again slowly, flipped through every absurd page. Recovery meals, medication reminders, suggested babysitting adjustments. I reached the vacation section again and almost laughed a second time. Then I looked up at my sister and smiled. Not angrily. That would have been easier for her. No, I smiled calmly, professionally. The kind of smile people use right before signing paperwork that ruins somebody's entire fiscal quarter. I'll make sure the schedule works perfectly for everyone, I said. The relief that flooded her face was immediate, total. She thought she'd won. That was the beautiful part. Chloe grabbed her purse quickly, already relaxing. I knew you'd come around, she said. Underneath all the military robot stuff, you still care about family. Military robot stuff. Amazing. I walked her to the door without correcting her, because when people underestimate you, interrupting them is usually a mistake. Her heels clicked sharply down the hallway as she left. Confident, victorious, completely unaware she had just handed a military logistics officer documented proof of coercion on a silver platter. The sound of those expensive heels faded farther down the corridor until all I could hear again was silence. Cold, sterile, controlled. Almost exactly like the hospital ethics committee boardroom waiting for me the next morning. I placed the navy blue folder on the conference table and watched 3 medical professionals immediately become nervous. That's the thing about organized documentation. People who deal with crisis for a living can smell it before they even open the file. The ethics committee room looked exactly how every hospital boardroom in America looks. Beige walls, cheap artwork pretending to calm people down, coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through drywall. A transplant coordinator sat across from me beside 2 hospital administrators and the head of the donor advocacy team, Dr. Levin. Late 60s, sharp eyes. The kind of doctor who probably ended arguments just by removing his glasses slowly. He folded his hands together. Captain Bennett, he said calmly, before we begin, I want to remind you this process exists to protect you as a donor. Nothing discussed here leaves this room without your consent. I nodded once. I understand. And I did. Better than Arthur or Beatrice ever could. Living organ donation in the United States is intentionally difficult for a reason. Hospitals are terrified of coercion cases. One bad transplant scandal can destroy a program's reputation permanently, which meant this room cared about one thing above all else: consent. Real consent. Not guilt, not pressure, not family manipulation disguised as morality. Real voluntary agreement. And, unfortunately for my parents, they had spent the last week behaving like cartoon villains at a hostage negotiation. Dr. Levin opened the folder carefully. Inside sat everything. Hospital discharge records from room 412, the social worker documentation, archived voicemail transcripts, financial statements, the forged withdrawal authorization, screenshots of Chloe's recovery schedule, including the stress relief vacation. Honestly, I almost appreciated her commitment to self-sabotage. The transplant coordinator beside him started flipping through the pages slowly. About 30 seconds in her expression changed. By page 6, nobody in the room was relaxed anymore. Good. Dr. Levin looked up first. Would you like to explain these documents in your own words? His tone stayed neutral, but I could hear the shift underneath it. This meeting had stopped being procedural. Now it was risk assessment. I sat back calmly in my chair. When I was 16, I said my appendix ruptured. My parents left me alone in the hospital for 4 days during emergency surgical recovery because my older sister had a cheerleading competition. Nobody interrupted. I continued. A hospital social worker documented concerns about neglect at the time. 2 days later, while I was still recovering, my parents emptied a custodial college account. My grandmother left me and forged my signature to transfer $18,450 into accounts later used for my sister's tuition and vehicle expenses. The administrator on the far end of the table stopped writing notes. That's usually not a good sign. I slid another sheet forward. Those are the transaction timestamps. Dr. Levin adjusted his glasses carefully. The transplant coordinator kept reading. Then she reached Chloe's printed recovery schedule. I watched her eyes stop at the childcare section, then the vacation section, then the highlighted note suggesting I recover inside Chloe's home while providing assistance with her children during post-operative healing. She blinked twice. You were given this voluntarily, she asked. Yes. Yesterday, yes. Another silence, not awkward silence. Professional horror silence. Different flavor entirely. I kept my voice level. My family contacted me after locating me through donor database matching. Prior to this medical emergency, I had not seen or spoken to them in approximately 15 years. Dr. Levin looked directly at me. And during these recent interactions, have you felt pressured to donate? I almost laughed. Pressured is a polite word for it. He nodded slightly. Describe it accurately then. So I did. No drama, no crying. That's the mistake people make when telling the truth. They think emotion makes it stronger. In reality, calm details terrify people far more. I explained the immediate surgical paperwork, the repeated family saves family language, the rushed timelines, the entitlement, the emotional framing, the fact that nobody once asked whether I wanted to donate, only when. I described Chloe showing up unannounced at my apartment, the recovery demands, the childcare expectations, the assumption that my military leave existed for their convenience. And then I explained the financial theft. That part changed the room completely, because now the committee wasn't looking at an emotionally complicated family situation anymore. Now they were looking at a potential pattern of long-term exploitation tied directly to the current donor request. Dr. Levin closed the folder slowly. Captain Bennett, he said carefully, are you currently willing to donate a kidney to your father voluntarily and without reservation? There it was. The real question. Not medical compatibility, not genetics. Consent. Pure, unpressured consent. I looked him directly in the eye. No, nobody moved. I continued calmly. I am being subjected to intense emotional and financial coercion by my abusers. The word abusers landed hard. Good. Because people like Arthur and Beatrice survive by replacing accurate language with softer substitutes. Strict parents, complicated family, miscommunication. No, abuse, neglect, fraud, coercion. Real things deserve real words. The transplant coordinator exhaled slowly. One administrator rubbed his forehead. Dr. Levin remained very still. That's when I knew the meeting was already over. Not officially, but institutionally. See, hospitals don't care about family narratives once liability enters the chat. And I had just handed them documented proof that this transplant request was wrapped in 15 years of manipulation, abandonment, and financial misconduct. No ethics board in America wants their donor program attached to that. Dr. Levin folded his hands again. Thank you for your honesty, he said quietly. Professional translation, your family is absolutely cooked. He asked a few more procedural questions after that. Did I feel safe? Did I anticipate retaliation? Did I want additional psychological support services? I answered clearly and directly. Then the transplant coordinator explained the next steps. Additional review, committee recommendation, formal donor eligibility determination, more careful wording designed to avoid lawsuits. Military life trains you to recognize bureaucratic kill shots when you see them. And this was one. Because once coercion enters official transplant documentation, everything changes. Every conversation gets scrutinized. Every interaction becomes evidence. Every push from the family becomes another reason to disqualify the donor permanently. Arthur and Beatrice thought the system existed to help them acquire an organ. They forgot the system also protects people from families exactly like them. Dr. Levin finally stood. "We'll conclude here for today." I nodded once and gathered none of my paperwork. I left the folder on the table intentionally, let them sit with it. Every page, every signature, every ugly little receipt from 15 years of pretending I didn't matter until parts of my body became useful. As I walked toward the hallway, the transplant coordinator quietly stopped me near the door. Her voice lowered slightly. "You did the right thing." I gave her a small nod. Then I stepped into the lobby and immediately saw Arthur, Beatrice, and Chloe sitting together near the windows, wearing the relaxed, smug expressions of people expecting good news. Arthur even smiled when he saw me. That part almost impressed me. Imagine emotionally neglecting someone for 15 years, attempting to pressure them into organ donation, stealing their college fund, and still expecting cooperation. That level of confidence should honestly qualify as a psychiatric condition. Arthur was discussing golf when they called us back into the consultation room. Golf, not mortality, not dialysis, not the fact that his body was currently running on hospital machinery and bad decisions. Golf. I'm just saying, he told Chloe while adjusting the sleeve of his expensive sweater. If recovery goes smoothly, I should still make the Naples trip by October. I almost admired the commitment to denial. Beatrice sat beside him with the rigid confidence of a woman who had spent her entire life believing enough money and aggressive eye contact could solve anything. And Chloe looked relaxed. That was my favorite part, relaxed. She'd clearly spent the last 24 hours imagining herself as the heroic daughter managing a difficult family crisis, while her weird military sister finally learned to cooperate. Meanwhile, I had already watched the ethics board quietly load the legal equivalent of a tactical missile into the chamber. The consultation room looked identical to the first one. Same beige walls, same polished table, same aggressively depressing lighting. Hospitals spend billions of dollars annually and still decorate like regional tax offices. Arthur lowered himself carefully into his chair beside the portable dialysis unit. The machine beeped steadily next to him. Beatrice looked at me briefly. No warmth, no shame, just expectation. Still, even now, that level of entitlement honestly deserves scientific study. A few minutes later, the door opened. Dr. Levin entered first. Behind him came the transplant coordinator, and beside her walked a hospital social worker carrying a folder. That was when the atmosphere changed. Arthur noticed it first. People who spend years manipulating rooms become very sensitive when the room stops cooperating. His smile faded slightly. "Doctor," he asked. Nobody sat immediately. Another bad sign. "Doctor." Levin remained standing at the far end of the table, with both hands folded calmly in front of him. Professional posture, careful tone. Exactly the kind hospitals use right before saying something legally devastating. After comprehensive review, he began. The transplant committee has reached a final determination regarding donor eligibility. Beatrice straightened instantly. Chloe actually smiled. Arthur looked directly at me like he expected gratitude. "Still, unbelievable," Dr. Levin continued. "Captain Clara Bennett has been permanently disqualified as a living donor in this case." Silence, pure silence. Arthur blinked once. Chloe frowned in confusion. Beatrice spoke first. What Dr. Levin's expression never changed. The committee identified severe familial coercion concerns, alongside documented historical abuse and financial exploitation directly connected to the donor-recipient relationship. There are moments when wealthy people hear consequences for the first time and genuinely cannot process the language. This was one of them. Arthur looked stunned, not guilty, not reflective, just confused that rules had suddenly started applying to him personally. Beatrice recovered first. "That is completely ridiculous," she snapped. Dr. Levin stayed calm. "The determination is final." "No," she said sharply. "There's obviously been some misunderstanding." "There has not." I stayed quiet. That was important, because the most effective destruction usually happens when you don't interrupt people digging their own graves. Chloe looked toward me suddenly. "What did you tell them?" Interesting phrasing again. Not "what happened." Not "are you okay?" Just immediate suspicion that I disrupted the plan. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "The truth." Arthur's face started changing color. Not metaphorically, literally. His neck reddened first. Then his jaw tightened. You told them private family business. Another classic. Abusive people always rebrand evidence as betrayal once documentation appears. Dr. Levin opened the folder in his hands. For clarity, he said evenly, the committee reviewed medical neglect records from the donor's childhood, documented evidence of financial misconduct involving custodial assets, and recent attempts to impose inappropriate recovery obligations during post-operative care. Chloe's entire body stiffened. There it was, the child care schedule. Honestly, that stupid vacation note deserved its own commemorative plaque. Beatrice suddenly slammed both hands against the table. This is insane. Several people in the hallway turned toward the room through the glass panel beside the door. Good, let witnesses enjoy the show. You are destroying this family over old misunderstandings, she hissed at me. Old misunderstandings. That was apparently today's replacement term for child abandonment and felony fraud. Arthur leaned forward aggressively. You ungrateful little Mr. Bennett. Dr. Levin interrupted sharply. I strongly advise you to lower your voice. That one surprised him. See, men like Arthur rely heavily on social hierarchy. He expected doctors to side with him automatically because he still saw himself as the important adult in the room. Unfortunately for him, transplant ethics committees care significantly more about lawsuits than patriarchy. Chloe looked panicked now, real panic, because unlike her parents, she finally understood what this meant. No donor, no clean rescue plan, no controlled narrative, and probably no hidden family money left to absorb the medical disaster coming next. Beatrice turned toward me again, and finally, after 15 years, the mask slipped completely. You selfish parasite, she spat. There it was, not grief, not disappointment, rage. Because I had stopped functioning correctly as family property. The room went completely still. Even the social worker looked horrified. I stood up slowly, full military uniform, perfect posture, completely calm. That calmness made Beatrice angrier than screaming ever would have. Because emotional people can be dismissed. Controlled people are dangerous. I reached into my folder and removed a single document. Then I slid it directly across the table toward Chloe. Not Arthur, not Beatrice, Chloe. Because golden children spend their whole lives believing consequences stop one person before reaching them. She looked down slowly, her face drained immediately. The letterhead at the top came from a military legal office. JAG Corps, United States Army. Formal demand for restitution regarding fraudulent transfer of custodial assets from a minor beneficiary account. Amount due $18,450 plus 12 years of accrued interest. I watched Chloe's hands start shaking slightly. Interesting. Apparently, entitlement has terrible stress tolerance. I'm not a parasite, I said calmly. Then I nodded toward the paper. But speaking of things that don't belong to you, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. You have 30 days before we file formal fraud claims. Arthur looked like someone had punched him in the chest. Beatrice grabbed the letter violently. This is extortion. No, I replied evenly. Extortion is pressuring an estranged daughter into organ donation after stealing her college fund. Dr. Levin looked deeply interested in the ceiling tiles suddenly. Smart man. Hospital administrators survive by pretending not to witness civilian executions. Chloe scanned the pages faster now. I didn't steal anything, she whispered. No, I agreed. You just built your entire adult life on stolen money. That one landed. Hard. Because for the first time since arriving at the hospital, Chloe looked directly at herself instead of the situation. I could actually see the realization happening in real time. The car, the tuition, the apartment, all of it connected back to a 16-year-old girl recovering alone in room 412. Arthur suddenly tried to stand too quickly. Bad idea. The dialysis machine beside him began beeping erratically as tubing shifted with the movement. Nurses outside reacted immediately. The room exploded into controlled medical chaos. But underneath all the movement, all the alarms, all the panic, I noticed something strange. For the first time in my life, nobody in that family was looking at me like I owed them something anymore. I picked up my folder before the nurses fully crowded around Arthur's chair. Nobody tried to stop me. Honestly, that was the strangest part. Not the yelling, not the panic, not even the fact that my mother looked like she wanted to set me on fire using pure rage and expensive moisturizer. It was the silence afterward. The complete collapse of certainty, because for the first time in their lives, my family had encountered a situation they couldn't socially engineer their way out of. No amount of money fixes transplant coercion documentation. No amount of country club networking erases fraud records. And no amount of shared DNA legally entitles you to somebody else's organs. That last one seemed especially difficult for them. I walked out of the consultation room while nurses adjusted Arthur's lines and a resident physician calmly asked him to sit back down before he disconnected himself from half the hospital equipment in a dramatic attempt to remain important. The hallway outside felt colder than before, or maybe I just finally noticed the air conditioning. Hospitals are weird like that. Human lives collapse inside them every day while somebody nearby still complains about parking validation. I passed the waiting area without looking back. Beatrice's voice followed me briefly from inside the room, sharp, angry, demanding. But underneath it now sat something new. Fear. Not fear for Arthur exactly. Fear of losing control permanently. That's the thing people misunderstand about manipulative families. Control becomes the addiction, the guilt, the obligation, the emotional debt. Once you stop participating, the entire system starts malfunctioning. And suddenly everyone calls you cruel for refusing to keep the machine running. I pushed through the hospital entrance doors and stepped outside into crisp afternoon air. Cold wind hit my face immediately. For a second, I just stood there breathing. No fluorescent lights, no dialysis monitors, no paperwork. Just fresh air and traffic noise. 15 years. That was how long I spent believing I needed to become useful enough to deserve protection. Children from healthy families don't understand that mindset. When you grow up emotionally neglected, you start treating your value like a performance review. Be smarter, more useful, more independent, less emotional, less expensive. Maybe then people stay. The army broke that thinking out of me eventually. Not through speeches, through consistency. Consistency changes people. You know what happens in functional units. People show up. That's it. That's the secret. They show up when things get ugly. During deployments, medical emergencies, breakups, funerals, 3 in the morning when your car dies outside a base gate and you're standing in freezing rain, questioning. Every life choice since middle school. Healthy people show up. And they don't usually ask for kidneys afterward. I walked toward the parking garage slowly. Halfway there, I spotted 3 familiar figures leaning near my car. Colonel Ramirez stood with his arms crossed beside a black SUV, looking exactly like every overworked senior officer who survives entirely on caffeine and spite. Next to him stood Sergeant Lewis and Captain Morgan. My people. None of them shared my blood. But Lewis once drove 4 hours overnight to help me move apartments after a deployment, because my movers canceled last minute. Morgan sat with me in a military hospital waiting room for 9 straight hours after a training accident left one of our unit medics in surgery. And Colonel Ramirez. He was the one who looked me dead in the eye years ago during a promotion review and said, "You apologize for existing too much." Honestly, that man did more parenting in 1 sentence than Arthur managed in 18 years. Lewis spotted me first. "You look disturbingly calm," he said. I shrugged. "I work in logistics. Emotional suppression is basically an Olympic sport." Morgan snorted. Ramirez studied my face carefully. Well, I adjusted the folder under my arm. The transplant committee permanently disqualified me. Lewis let out a low whistle. "That bad worse," I said. "Legally documented." Morgan's eyebrows lifted immediately. "Oh, somebody's getting audited by the universe." Exactly, that was the perfect description. Because this never felt like revenge to me. Revenge is emotional. This was accountability. Cold, administrative, very expensive accountability. Ramirez nodded once toward the hospital behind me. "You okay?" That question hit differently now. Not because it was dramatic, because he meant it. No hidden agenda, no manipulation, no expectation attached. Just concern. Real concern feels weird when you didn't grow up with it. I thought about the consultation room upstairs, Arthur panicking, Beatrice screaming, Chloe finally realizing her entire adult life sat on top of stolen foundations. And honestly, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. That's different. Victory still keeps you emotionally attached to the fight. Finished means the fight no longer owns space inside you. "I'm okay," I said finally. And for the first time in years, I actually meant it. We stood there talking for a while, in the parking structure while traffic echoed below us. Normal conversation, deployment gossip, base rumors. Lewis complaining about military coffee like it personally insulted his ancestors. Life moving forward. That's another thing toxic families never understand. They think abandoning someone freezes them in place emotionally, like you'll stay 16 forever waiting for approval. But people move on. They build careers, friendships, communities, lives. And eventually the people who treated you like nothing become strangers asking for pieces of your body. Funny how time works. Before getting into my car, I looked back once toward the hospital windows. Somewhere up there, Arthur was probably still blaming everyone except himself. Beatrice was likely planning social damage control already. And Chloe, honestly, I hoped she finally questioned the story she'd been raised inside. Maybe she would. Maybe she wouldn't. That part wasn't my responsibility anymore. Because here's the truth, nobody tells kids raised in families like mine. You do not owe your life to people who only remember you exist when they need something from you. Not your money, not your peace, not your future, and definitely not your organs. Biology creates relatives. Behavior creates family. Those are not the same thing. A title like mother or father is earned through protection, consistency, sacrifice, and love, not genetics. Genetics are just paperwork. If someone spends years treating you like an option, you have every right to make yourself completely unavailable. I got into my car, set the folder in the passenger seat, and finally let myself laugh a little. Because somewhere inside that hospital, my mother was probably still trying to argue with an ethics committee. And if there's one thing stronger than narcissism in America, it's hospital liability policy. Would you have agreed to the testing? Or would you have walked away the moment they asked? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not owed. The weirdest part about telling this story publicly was realizing how many people immediately tried to minimize it because my family looks successful from the outside. That happens a lot. People hear country club parents and immediately picture stability. They hear nice house and assume safety. They hear cheerleader sister and mentally build a Hallmark movie before the actual facts even arrive. But abuse does not always look dramatic. Sometimes abuse wears pearls. Sometimes it drives luxury SUVs. Sometimes it volunteers at church hosts charity events and still leaves one child emotionally starving inside the same house where another child gets treated like royalty. That's the part I really need people to understand. A child does not become hyper-independent by accident. Kids are supposed to ask for help. That's normal, healthy even. But when you grow up learning that every need becomes an inconvenience, your brain adapts. You stop asking. You stop expecting comfort. You start solving everything alone because experience taught you vulnerability comes with consequences. By the time I joined the Army, I was already emotionally trained to operate like a survival machine. Never complain. Never depend on anyone. Never become expensive. People praise those traits constantly: discipline, professionalism, strength. Meanwhile, half of it was unresolved childhood damage wearing combat boots. And I know a lot of people watching this understand exactly what I mean. Maybe your parents paid for your clothes and still made you feel unwanted. Maybe one sibling could do no wrong while you got blamed for the weather. Maybe your family only became loving when they needed money, childcare, emotional support, or somebody to absorb their mistakes quietly. That's not love. That's resource management. One thing toxic families do extremely well is confuse obligation with love. They teach you that access to you is automatic. Your time belongs to them. Your money belongs to them. Your emotional energy belongs to them. And if you ever say no, suddenly you're cold, dramatic, selfish, or my personal favorite, ungrateful. Ungrateful for what exactly? Surviving conditions you created. That's like setting somebody's kitchen on fire and expecting applause because you handed them a bucket afterward. The truth is emotionally neglectful. Families often rely on appearances because appearances protect them from accountability. People saw Arthur and Beatrice as polished, successful parents. They didn't see the reality inside the house because toxic families usually perform normalcy in public. That performance matters to them more than actual relationships. And honestly, that's why so many adult children struggle to explain emotional abuse. Because unless somebody physically hits you, society tends to treat your pain like an overreaction. But emotional neglect changes people permanently. It affects relationships, self-worth, decision-making, stress responses. You start over-explaining yourself constantly because you grew up defending your right to exist. You apologize for tiny mistakes. You panic when someone sounds irritated. You feel guilty resting because your value was tied to usefulness for so long. And the dangerous part, A lot of high-functioning adults mistake survival skills for healing. I did for years. Just because you're successful doesn't mean you're healed. You can have a career stability, military rank, degrees, money, and still feel internally responsible for everyone else's emotions. That takes work to unlearn. Real work. Not motivational quotes online from people named Mindset King 92. Actual work. Therapy helped. Distance helped. But the biggest thing that helped was learning to judge relationships by patterns instead of titles. That changed my entire life, because titles mean nothing without behavior behind them. A person can technically be your mother and still emotionally abandon you. A person can technically be your father and still see you as useful only when convenient. And a person can technically be family while actively damaging your mental health every time they enter the room. Biology explains relation. It does not guarantee love. One of the healthiest things you can learn as an adult is this. You are allowed to evaluate family relationships using the same standards you apply to everyone else. Would you tolerate constant manipulation from a coworker? No. Would you tolerate financial exploitation from a friend? No. Would you tolerate somebody contacting you only when they need something? Absolutely not. Then why do people expect unconditional access simply because they share your last name? That logic never made sense to me. And look, setting boundaries will upset manipulative people. That's normal. People benefiting from your lack of boundaries rarely celebrate when you finally grow some. Suddenly you're different, difficult, brainwashed. Meanwhile, the only thing that actually changed is you stopped volunteering for emotional exploitation. That's why I tell people this now as clearly as possible. Boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are evidence that you finally realized your life belongs to you. And if someone only remembers you exist when they need a favor, money, emotional labor, or a spare organ, you are not dealing with love. You are dealing with entitlement wearing a family label. The part nobody really talks about is what happens after you escape. Movies always end right after the survivor walks away. Credits roll, music plays. Everybody assumes the healing part just magically handles itself off-screen. Real life is a lot less cinematic. You can leave a toxic family physically and still carry them mentally for years. I did. For a long time, I thought success would fix everything. If I became disciplined enough, successful enough, useful enough, maybe eventually I'd stop feeling like the unwanted kid in room 412. That mindset followed me straight into adulthood. And honestly, society rewards people like that at first. You become dependable, productive, independent. You show up early, you work late. You never ask for help. Bosses love you. The military especially loves people who can function under pressure without complaining. The problem is eventually your nervous system stops recognizing the difference between responsibility and survival mode. That's where burnout starts. A lot of adults from toxic families become high achievers because achievement feels safer than vulnerability. Think about it. If love felt conditional growing up, your brain starts treating performance like protection. Good grades, good career, good income, good reputation. You become the human version of a resume, trying to earn the right to feel secure. And the dangerous part is from the outside it looks healthy. People compliment you constantly. You're so strong. You're so independent. You have your life together. Meanwhile, internally, you feel guilty sitting still for 20 minutes because your brain associates rest with laziness and laziness with rejection. That's not confidence. That's fear wearing professional clothing. I didn't realize how bad my mindset had gotten until one of my closest friends in the Army called me out years ago. I had just worked almost 30 straight hours during a medical logistics emergency. No sleep, terrible coffee, pure government-funded suffering. And afterward, instead of resting like a normal person, I started apologizing because I thought I hadn't done enough. My friend looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Clara, you treat yourself like a machine people rent by the hour." That sentence hit me harder than therapy, honestly, because he was right. When you grow up emotionally neglected, you often become extremely useful while secretly believing your usefulness is the only reason people tolerate you. So you overperform constantly. You become the reliable one, the fixer, the stable one, the person everybody calls during emergencies. But deep down, part of you still fears that if you stop producing value, people will leave. That's why healing takes more than distance. You have to rebuild your understanding of relationships completely. Healthy relationships do not operate like emotional hostage negotiations. Healthy people do not constantly keep score. They do not remind you of every favor they ever did. They do not weaponize kindness later. And they definitely do not demand pieces of your internal organs like they're collecting overdue library books. That realization changed the way I approached every relationship in my life. Friendships, dating, work, everything. I started paying attention to patterns instead of words. Anybody can say they love you. Manipulative people say it constantly. The real question is, how do they behave when you disappoint them? How do they behave when you say no? How do they behave when helping you becomes inconvenient? That's where character lives. One thing I really want viewers to understand is that practical independence matters too, not just emotionally, legally, and financially. Learn how your bank accounts work. Keep copies of important documents. Understand contracts before signing them. Know your medical rights. Know who has access to your information. Manipulative people thrive when you're confused, dependent, or overwhelmed. And honestly, adulthood gets a lot less scary once you understand basic systems. That was one reason the Army helped me so much. Structure teaches confidence. Knowledge removes fear. Once you understand how hospitals' legal systems, finances, and boundaries actually work, manipulative people stop feeling all-powerful. They start looking predictable. Because most toxic people use the exact same strategies repeatedly. Guilt, pressure, obligation, victim playing, image management, temporary kindness right before another request. And here's something else nobody warns you about. Toxic relatives often escalate once they realize control is slipping. Sometimes they get aggressive. Sometimes they suddenly become emotional. Sometimes they act incredibly nice out of nowhere. That part confuses a lot of people. They think, maybe they finally changed. Usually they didn't. Usually they just noticed consequences approaching. That's why consistency matters more than apologies. A real apology changes behavior. Manipulative apologies only change tone. And trust me, there's a difference. And I'm not saying people can't grow. They can. But growth requires accountability, not performance, not tears, not dramatic speeches during family holidays, after 2 glasses of wine and a spiritual podcast. Actual accountability. The kind that costs something. The kind that changes patterns permanently. Because at the end of the day, healing is not becoming emotionless. Healing is learning that your value is never supposed to depend on how much pain you could survive quietly for other people. One of the hardest lessons I had to learn was understanding the difference between loneliness and peace. Those are not the same thing. A lot of people stay trapped in toxic family systems because they're terrified of being alone. Manipulative relatives know that. They weaponize it constantly. You'll regret cutting us off. Nobody will ever love you like family. You only get one mother. That last one is technically true. You also only get one appendix, and if it turns toxic enough, doctors remove it. So let's calm down with the sacred organ arguments. The reality is being surrounded by people who constantly drain, shame, manipulate, or exploit you creates its own kind of loneliness. Honestly, in some ways, it's worse because you start doubting your own instincts. You begin questioning whether your pain is even valid. That's what toxic environments do over time. They normalize dysfunction until basic respect starts feeling suspicious. When I first left home at 17, I thought independence meant isolation. I trusted nobody, handled everything alone, kept emotional distance from almost everyone, not because I was strong, because I was scared. There's a huge difference. People raised in stable homes often don't realize how confusing healthy relationships feel at first when you come from dysfunction. Kindness feels fake. Consistency feels temporary. You keep waiting for the hidden price tag. I remember one of my first holidays after joining the Army. I didn't have leave approved, so I stayed on base while most people traveled home. I figured I'd spend Thanksgiving alone, eating terrible cafeteria turkey that somehow tasted both dry and wet at the same time. Honestly, military kitchens perform scientific miracles in the field of disappointment. Then one of the sergeants in my unit found out I was staying behind. Next thing I knew, his family invited me to their house. Nothing dramatic happened there. That's what made it important. Nobody interrogated me. Nobody guilt-tripped me. Nobody treated kindness like a transaction waiting for repayment later. They just handed me food, argued about football, and included me at the table like it was normal. I remember driving back afterward feeling genuinely confused. Not emotional, confused. Because my nervous system literally did not know how to process care without manipulation attached to it. That's when I started realizing something important. Healthy love feels calm, not confusing, not exhausting, not conditional, calm. You don't spend every conversation managing someone's emotions carefully to avoid punishment later. You don't feel your stomach tighten every time your phone lights up. You don't feel guilty for having boundaries. And you definitely don't get treated like an emergency backup organ with military-grade childcare responsibilities attached. Over time, the people who became my real family weren't connected to me by blood at all. They were connected through consistency, shared deployments, shared struggles, showing up. That's it. That's the real foundation of family. Who shows up when life gets ugly. Who respects your boundaries, who treats your pain like it matters instead of an inconvenience disrupting their schedule. Those people matter more than genetics ever will. And listen, I know some people watching this probably feel guilty even considering distance from toxic relatives. That guilt is normal, especially if you were raised to believe protecting yourself is selfish. But protecting your peace is not selfish. Refusing exploitation is not selfish. Saying no to people who only value you when you're useful is not selfish. It's adulthood. One thing I wish somebody told me earlier is this. You are allowed to stop auditioning for love. You do not need to constantly prove your worth through sacrifice. You do not need to bleed for people just because they raised you. And you are not obligated to destroy yourself emotionally, financially, or physically to maintain relationships that only survive through guilt. That lesson changed my entire life. Because once you stop chasing approval from people committed to misunderstanding you, something strange happens. You finally have energy left to build a real life. A peaceful one. Not perfect, just peaceful. There's a difference. These days, my life is actually pretty boring most of the time. And honestly, I love that. No chaos. No emotional landmines. No manipulative phone calls demanding immediate loyalty because someone suddenly remembers we share DNA. Just work friends, quiet weekends, bad coffee, and people who treat me like a human being instead of a resource. That's peace. And if you grew up in dysfunction, peace will feel unfamiliar at first. Maybe even uncomfortable. Choose it anyway. Because healing is not becoming cold or emotionless. Healing is finally understanding that your life has value, even when you stop sacrificing yourself for people who never protected you in return. And if this story connected with you, if you've ever dealt with toxic family dynamics, emotional neglect, manipulation, or the exhausting pressure to keep proving your worth to people who should have loved you freely in the first place, subscribe to the channel. There are a lot more stories like this coming, not just drama. Real stories about boundaries, survival, self-respect, and learning how to protect your future before toxic people try to claim ownership over it.